Idaho has a way of surprising you gently. At first glance, it can look like a calm state. Blue lakes, green ridgelines, small towns tucked into wide valleys. The kind of place you might think you already understand from a few photos. But the longer you stay with it, the more Idaho starts revealing what's underneath that quiet surface. A landscape shaped by ancient fire, persistent water, and long stretches of time. This is a place where the ground tells stories if you know how to listen. Where rivers don't just flow, they carve. Where mountains aren't just scenery, they're the backbone of entire regions. And where, if you travel far enough, you start to feel the distance between modern life and the older, wilder Idaho that still holds its shape. Welcome to Era Trails. And if you enjoy documentaries that blend beauty with meaning, stories that explore not just what a place looks like, but why it became what it is, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps the channel grow, and it keeps you with us for the journeys ahead. In this episode, we're traveling across Idaho in chapters. We'll begin in the south, following the Snake River as it opens the land and sets the scale. Then, we'll climb into the central high country, where the sawtooths rise and the air changes. And later, we'll push toward the state's wilder edges, toward places like Craters of the Moon and Hell's Canyon, where Idaho starts to feel bigger than you expected. But every journey needs a first step, and ours begins with water. Because to understand Idaho, you don't start at the mountaintops. You start where the river shows you what time can do. Our first destination is Shoshone Falls, Snake River, near Twin Falls, Idaho. You don't need a guide to know when you're close. The sound arrives first, bouncing around the walls of the Snake River Canyon, a steady force that turns into a roar as you reach the rim. Shoshone Falls sits on the Snake River in south-central Idaho, roughly 3 miles northeast of Twin Falls, near the boundary of Jerome County and Twin Falls County. The drop is about 212 feet, and the rim span is roughly 900 to 925 feet, which is why it's often compared to Niagara Falls on size alone. The shape of the waterfall is dictated by the rock and the channel right above it. Upstream, the river tightens into rapids, splits around small islands, and then pitches over a horseshoe-shaped cliff. When flows are high, the brink can present as a single heavy curtain. When flows are low, the waterfall fractures into separated strands. One of the best-known segments is Bridal Veil Falls on the northern side. Geologically, this is Snake River Plain country. Large sections of the canyon are cut into resistant basalt from past volcanic activity, and the falls exist where harder rock helps hold a step in the riverbed. In this area, that step is often tied to a resistant volcanic unit referred to as Shoshone Falls rhyolite, which helps maintain the drop as a persistent nick point instead of letting the river smooth itself into a gentler slope. Then comes the event that explains why the canyon feels oversized. During the late Ice Age, Lake Bonneville catastrophically spilled through Red Rock Pass, producing the Bonneville Flood, a megaflood that surged across southern Idaho and aggressively scoured and enlarged channels. It's part of why the Snake River Canyon around Twin Falls reads like it was built for more water than it carries most days. What you see at the brink today is not just geology, it's management. The waterfall's presence and volume are heavily influenced upstream at Milner Dam and the broader Upper Snake Reservoir system because the Snake is a working river in an agricultural region. In spring, snowmelt can push flows into the thousands of cubic feet per second, and examples around 4,000 CEFs are commonly cited for peak viewing periods. Later, as irrigation diversions increase, flows can drop dramatically, sometimes into the hundreds of CFS, and the falls can thin into separate ribbons. A minimum scenic flow target is also commonly cited around 300 ettafluoffs in summer, though actual appearance still depends on supply and competing demands. There's another hidden system in the background that explains why the canyon can still have life and water even when the main river upstream is being heavily diverted: the Eastern Snake River Plain Aquifer. Downstream reaches of the canyon are recharged by spring discharge, return flows, and drains, including the famous Thousand Springs area farther along the corridor. That groundwater connection is a key piece of the "how the river still exists here" story. On the rim and open slopes, the plant community reflects high desert shrub steppe. Documented and commonly noted species here include big sagebrush, rubber rabbitbrush, and Rocky Mountain juniper. Where moisture pockets exist closer to the river and draws, the community shifts toward riparian and edge species such as black cottonwood, chokecherry, woods rose, and broadleaf cattail. The corridor also carries invasive and introduced plants recorded along the rim trail environment, including cheatgrass, Russian olive, and black locust, species that can change habitat structure and fire behavior over time. Wildlife here makes sense once you read the terrain: cliffs, open air, and a river corridor. Documented birds and raptors include red-tailed hawk, American kestrel, and golden eagle. Water-associated birds include American white pelican and mallard. The rock itself is habitat for specialists like canyon wren, and the slopes support mammals such as yellow-bellied marmot and cliff chipmunk. Reptiles documented in the corridor include western fence lizard and western skink, with the broader high desert edge supporting species such as prairie rattlesnake. Shoshone Falls is also an ecological boundary with consequences. Historically, it functioned as a complete upstream barrier for migratory fish on this section of the Snake River, including salmon, meaning the falls marked an upstream limit line in the river system. That boundary shaped human use as well. The site is tied to the Shoshone, including the Lemhi Shoshone, and is associated with fishing and seasonal gathering in a region where salmon historically mattered for survival and movement. The public access story is also specific. Travelers were detouring to the falls in the 19th century. Proposals were made around 1900 to elevate its status, and in 1932, the land was donated to the city of Twin Falls by Frederick and Martha Adams under the condition it remain a public park. One of the reasons Shoshone Falls Park exists as an accessible overlook and trail destination today. So, this is the full picture of Shoshone Falls. A waterfall held in place by basalt and rhyolite, scaled up by an Ice Age megaflood, and reshaped in the modern era by Milner Dam, reservoir operations, and irrigation demand, while the eastern Snake River Plain aquifer quietly keeps the canyon's water story alive downstream. But Idaho doesn't let you stay in the water story for long. From the Snake River Canyon, we turn away from the river and head north onto the Snake River Plain, into a landscape built not by erosion, but by eruption, where the ground is still shaped by ancient lava, and the horizon looks like it cooled in place. Our next destination is from the Snake River Canyon. The story turns away from water and into fire. The road climbs onto the open Snake River Plain, and the ground changes character. The river-carved world falls behind. In front, the surface is built, not cut. This is Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve. This monument and preserve protects one of the most concentrated volcanic landscapes in the continental United States. The terrain here is dominated by basalt and the features that form when low viscosity lava erupts repeatedly from long cracks in the earth. Those cracks are fissure vents, and the system that organizes them across the monument is known as the Great Rift. The Great Rift is the spine of this place. It is not one mountain. It is a line of eruptive vents and cones that produced repeated lava outpourings, along with explosive fragments known as tephra. Many eruptions here were monogenetic volcanoes, built quickly and then effectively finished, leaving behind a field of separate cones, craters, and flows rather than one single long-lived volcano. The first skill this landscape teaches is how to read lava like a map. Some flows hardened into rough, broken surfaces known as with jagged clinker underfoot. Others cooled into smoother, ropier sheets known as pahoho, where the surface can look folded, as if it was poured and then paused mid-motion. Mixed into those flows are constructional features like cinder cones and spatter cones, each one a marker of where lava and gas pushed through the crust and built a landform around the vent. The park's main route, the Loop Drive, works like a guided cross-section through volcanic processes. It moves from broad flow fields to clustered cones, then into areas where the ground opens into pits and collapses. Each stop is essentially a different paragraph in the same geologic sentence. One of the clearest orientation points is Inferno Cone. From the top, the view simplifies everything. You can see the spread of dark flows, the alignment of vents, and the way cones sit like punctuation across the plain. Nearby, features such as North Crater and Big Craters make it easier to understand what crater means here. These are volcanic structures tied to vents and collapses, not impact scars from space. Then the landscape drops underground. One of the most important features in this monument is the lava tube system. Lava tubes form when the surface of a flow cools into a rigid crust, while molten lava continues moving beneath. If the lava drains away, a tunnel remains. Openings in these tunnels can appear as roof collapses called skylights, and the monument includes accessible tube features such as Indian Tunnel and nearby caves like Dewdrop Cave. This is the same lava, but reorganized into architecture. The monument is not just black rock either. It also contains ecological holdouts that never got buried by the younger flows. These islands of older ground surrounded by newer lava are called kipukas. A named example is Kari Kipuka, where older soils and established plant communities persist, while fresh lava fields nearby remain sparse. Kipukas act like time capsules, letting you compare what thousands of years of soil building can do versus bare volcanic rock. Plant life here is not a decoration, it is a sequence. On recent basalt, early colonizers begin with lichens, then grasses and shrubs take hold, where wind-blown dust and organic material collect in cracks and depressions. Across the monument's shrub steppe zones, common and notable plants include big sagebrush, rubber rabbit brush, and bitterbrush. In pockets where conditions allow long-lived trees, you can find limber pine holding ground in a place that looks, at first glance, like it should reject anything rooted. The animal story also tracks the terrain. Open lava fields and sage steppe favor wide-ranging mammals and opportunistic hunters. In and around this landscape, animals commonly associated with this kind of country include pronghorn, mule deer, coyote, and American badger. Birds that thrive in open, harsh terrain and that use rock and thermals as advantage include common raven. The lava itself becomes habitat, creating shelter lines, den sites, and sun-warmed surfaces that support smaller life along the margins of the flows. There is also a human layer that predates the park boundaries. This volcanic plain sits within long-used homelands and travel landscapes of indigenous peoples, including the Shoshone and Bannock, who moved through, hunted, and lived with this terrain as a real place, not an exhibit. The moon comparison is modern. The ground itself has always been local. What makes Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve Land so hard is not just that it is volcanic. It is that it is legible. The systems are exposed. You can stand on Peihoho and see flow direction frozen in texture. You can climb Inferno Cone and trace the line of the Great Rift across the plain. You can step into Indian Tunnel and understand how a river of lava once moved under a cooling skin. And when you leave this place, the contrast carries forward, because Idaho does not stick to one element for long. From the cooled black surfaces of basalt and the vent lines of the Great Rift, the journey keeps moving into the next shift in terrain, where the state trades volcanic rock for a different kind of extreme. In southern Idaho, the skyline changes without warning. Not into mountains, not into cliffs, but into a field of stone forms that look arranged, towers, walls, and silhouettes that read like architecture from a distance. This is City of Rocks National Reserve, paired with Castle Rocks, where the landscape stops being background and starts being structure. Now, the rock itself, City of Rocks. National Reserve is a granite landscape, intrusive igneous rock that formed deep underground and only later became surface scenery. This matters because it means these buildings were not piled up on the surface like lava. They were shaped from a buried mass exposed over time, with the surface carved away until the hard core was left standing. The mechanism that turns granite into a city is not a single dramatic event. It's a slow system of break lines and separation. The rock develops joints and fractures. Water works into those lines. Temperature swings and freeze-thaw cycles pry them wider. Blocks begin to isolate. Surfaces round and peel through exfoliation. Over long spans, weathering and erosion do what they always do. They remove the weaker pathways first and leave the most resistant shapes behind. That is why the landforms here look designed when they are not. What you're seeing are spires, monoliths, rounded domes, knife-like pinnacles, and scattered boulder fields, all the same material, separated and sculpted along natural fracture patterns. This is geology that reads like a skyline because the rock breaks in a way that produces vertical structure. And the setting amplifies it. In open high desert space, isolated stone forms feel larger than they measure. There's less clutter, fewer trees, fewer visual references. The towers stand alone, and the eye treats them like a city block because they occupy the horizon the way buildings do. This place was never truly hidden. Long before it became a recreation destination, it was a recognizable landmark along the California Trail corridor, part of the wider immigrant route system that carried people west across difficult country. A skyline like this doesn't need a signpost. It tells you where you are from miles away, and for travelers moving through with limited water, limited time, and animals that needed rest, recognizable terrain mattered. If you bring the camera closer, the human layer becomes tangible in the stone itself. One of the most direct artifacts in this chapter is Register Rock, where emigrants left inscriptions, names and dates pressed into a landscape that already felt permanent. It's a simple act, but the logic is obvious. If you survived the crossing to reach a place this distinct, you used the rock like a ledger. You marked that you were here. Today, the interaction has changed, but it still follows the same fracture lines. City of Rocks National Reserve is internationally known for climbing, especially crack climbing and trad climbing, because the same joints and fractures that shape the towers also define climbable lines. The granite texture, the vertical faces, and the spacing of features turn the reserve into a natural library of routes, each one literally inherited from the rock's internal structure. And then the chapter continues next door. Castle Rocks belongs in this same story, not as an entirely new destination, but as the next district of the same stone landscape. The granite forms keep going. More spires, more monoliths, more separated towers, arranged differently across the terrain, changing the angles and spacing, changing how the skyline reads as you move through it. The living layer follows suit. Big sagebrush and rubber rabbit brush still dominate the open ground, while juniper continues to claim the protected pockets where the rock makes microclimates. So this chapter is a three-layer system you can see in one place. Deep-time granite exposed and divided by fractures, a human corridor marked by the California Trail and register rock, and a modern recreation identity built on trad climbing and the same crack networks that shaped the stone. And now we leave carved granite architecture behind and return to Idaho's other element. Because the next landscape isn't built from stone that cooled underground, it's built from stone that cooled on the surface, lava laid out across the plain. From the cooled black surfaces of craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, Idaho shifted into carved stone architecture at City of Rocks National Reserve, a landscape where time shows up as towers, cracks, and separation. But the timeline doesn't stop at rock. Next, we drop back toward the Snake River Plain and the corridor of the Snake River, where the story changes from what the earth built to what the earth preserved. Our next destination is Hagerman Fossil Beds National Monument, a place where Idaho's past isn't inferred from formations, it's recovered from them. From the granite towers of City of Rocks National Reserve, Idaho's story drops back toward the Snake River corridor, where the land stops showing you how it formed and starts showing you what it kept. This is Hagerman Fossil Beds National Monument, a place built from layered sedimentary rock and volcanic rock, and famous for the fossils locked inside those layers. Before we go back in time, look at what lives here now. Along the river edge, you'll see riparian vegetation, like black cottonwood, willow, and bulrush, with invasive plants such as Russian olive, tamarisk, and purple leucostrife established along parts of the shoreline and drainages. In the air, seasonal birds and raptors pass through or hunt these margins, including ospreys, bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and rough-legged hawks, while songbirds like marsh wrens, rufous-sided towhees, and various warblers use the thicker cover. That modern ecology tracks the topography. The river corridor concentrates life because water and shade concentrate life. Step back from the riparian line, and the ground opens out into drier uplands, where disturbance-tolerant species like cheatgrass, Russian thistle, wheatgrass, blue mustard, tansy mustard, and tumble mustard can take hold. Even the small animals that show up in management documents, like cottontails, make sense here, because edges, cover, and food are distributed in strips, not evenly, across the landscape. Now look at the landforms themselves. Hagerman is defined by steep bluffs that have been deeply cut by arroyos, exposing stacked layers like a cross-section. This is a landscape where erosion doesn't just shape scenery, it reveals a readable timeline. Geologically, the monument exposes units assigned to the Idaho group and the Snake River group, including the Pliocene Glens Ferry Formation, plus younger Pleistocene Tuana gravel and Yahoo clay. Those names matter because they're the shelves that hold the record. Sediments, ash layers, and volcanic material laid down and then later carved open by the Snake River and runoff. And the record we came for sits in a tight window of deep time. The monument's fossils represent the Pliocene epoch, roughly 4 to 3 million years ago, when this part of Idaho looked nothing like the semi-arid bluffs you see today. The National Park Service describes a world of wetlands, forests, and grasslands, habitats that supported a full animal community, not a single headline species. That's why fossil beds is the correct name, not just a fossil. Hagerman preserves remains from more than 140 fossil species documented in park materials, and broader park history writing emphasizes that the overall tally of fossil plants and animals found here pushes past 200. The point isn't the exact number, it's the completeness. Enough species, across enough layers, to rebuild an ecosystem rather than a curiosity. If you want the cast list, the monument's own framing gives it to you. Extinct animals like the saber-toothed cat, mastodon, and ground sloth, alongside more familiar forms like horses, beavers, and birds. These aren't random finds. They're snapshots from a working landscape. Water, cover, prey, predators, preserved in place. The headliner is the Hagerman horse, Equus simplicidans. Hagerman Fossil Beds is best known for it, and for one specific reason, the sheer concentration. The NPS notes that specimens from over 200 individuals were found, one of the largest single finds of this species, and that it represents one of the earliest known species in the genus Equus, tying it directly into the line that leads toward modern horses. So, how does a place like this preserve so much? In plain terms, deposition plus burial plus time. Lake and stream sediments of the Glens Ferry Formation were laid down in a dynamic system, with layers of volcanic ash and volcanic material interbedded in the deposits, useful for correlation and timing. Then erosion did the second job. It cut the arroyos, steepened the bluffs, and exposed the beds so we can see them now. This is also why the monument is managed the way it is. Fossils here are not souvenirs. They're context-dependent scientific resources. Park rules restrict travel to designated paths in developed areas and prohibit off-trail shortcuts, because the ground itself can be a protected record. The idea is simple. If the timeline is in the sediment, you don't trample the pages. For visitors, the public-facing start point is the Thousand Springs Visitor Center, opened in 2022 as a shared home base for the National Monument and the surrounding state park units. The NPS notes it's the only place at the monument where you can see fossils on display. So the story isn't just out on the bluffs. It's also curated, explained, and anchored with real specimens. And that's the Hagerman shift in the Idaho flow. After lava fields and granite skylines, we arrive at a place where the landscape isn't just dramatic, it's evidentiary. The Snake River cuts the present. The Pliocene epoch waits in the layers, and the boundary between them is a bluff edge where geology becomes a record you can read. After the fossil-rich layers of Hagerman fossil beds, the road drops us into a different kind of time machine. Here in southwest Idaho's Owyhee Desert, the story is not bones in rock, it's motion. Wind, sand, and sky. Bruneau Dunes is a place where the ground is still actively rearranging itself, one gust at a time. Before we climb anything, take stock of what's living out here. The dry uplands sit in Great Basin sagebrush steppe, anchored by big sagebrush, bitterbrush, and rabbitbrush, with grasses threading between them. Around the park's ponds, the palette flips to wetland edges, cattails, bulrushes, and water lilies, plus shoreline trees like cottonwoods and willows. That mix of dry and wet pulls in life at every scale, from coyotes and black-tailed jackrabbits to gopher snakes, rattlesnakes, and water birds like teal, mallards, buffleheads, grebes, scops, and herons. The centerpiece is blunt and simple, the tallest single-structured sand dune in North America, rising about 470 feet above the surrounding desert floor. It's not a dune field where everything is the same height. It's one dominant mass that forces you to feel scale in your legs and lungs. The why of it starts with a trap. The dunes sit inside Eagle Cove, an old cut-off meander of the Snake River. Beneath the sand are lacustrine sediments from the Glens Ferry Formation and the Bruneau Formation, and the basin shape makes it hard for wind-blown sand to escape once it drops in. Then the wind does the rest, pushing and reworking the pile over and over. Even the sand tells you where it came from. By volume, it's been measured at roughly 62% quartz, 26% feldspar, and 12% basaltic particles, a composition that matches those nearby formation sediments better than it matches the darker basalt surfaces upstream. In other words, this isn't random beach sand teleported into the desert. It's local geology, ground down and repurposed into terrain you can climb. Then there's the reset button in the region's deep memory, the Bonneville Flood. Around 15,000 years ago, water released from Lake Bonneville surged down the Snake River system with catastrophic force. Research tied to Eagle Cove suggests that a flood on that scale would have stripped away any older wind-built sand here, meaning the dunes you see today are part of a younger cycle that built up after that event. On the ground, Bruneau Dunes is a physics lesson you can't ignore. Footsteps sink, slopes shift, and every ridgeline is temporary. The climb is slow because the surface is always trying to slide back downhill. This is why the park's dune landscape is treated like its own fragile system, and why the fun here is mostly human-powered, hiking the crests, dropping into bowls, and riding the faces on a sandboard instead of chewing it up with engines. And right in the middle of all that dry motion, you get water. The park's lakes are shallow enough to behave more like ponds, with rooted plants and productive edges. One of them is Little Dune Lake, and around these waters you'll see the wetland community doing what wetlands do: feeding insects, sheltering amphibians, drawing birds, and stitching together a food web that feels impossible in a place built of sand. If you want the other half of Bruneau, you stay after dark. The park is an international dark sky park, recognized for how much night it still has, and it backs that up with public observatories. The long-running Bruneau Dunes Observatory houses the 25-inch Newtonian reflecting telescope nicknamed Obsession, and recent upgrades have added a second major facility so visitors can go deeper than naked-eye stargazing. In a landscape this open, the sky becomes its own destination. Even the smallest residents have their specialists. The dunes around Bruneau are one of the limited places associated with the Idaho dunes tiger beetle, a reminder that just sand can be rare habitat with its own fragile rules. Bruneau Dunes is big enough to feel unreal, but it's also very grounded. About 4,800 acres of shifting sand dune relief, ponds, trails, and one of the most public-friendly dark sky setups in the state. The point is not to conquer the dune. The point is to stand on a crest, watch wind rewrite the surface in real time, and realize Idaho is not only mountains and rivers. Sometimes it's a desert that moves. Coming out of Idaho's high desert country, Wood River Valley feels like a clean gear shift. The light changes, the air cools, and the land tightens into a mountain corridor framed by the Boulder Mountains, the Pioneer Mountains, and the Smoky Mountains. Underneath it all is structure. The valley sits in a fault-bounded basin, a graben filled with younger deposits, shaped and reshaped by ice and water over repeated glacial cycles. To understand why this place became famous, you start in the 1930s. In 1935, Union Pacific's Averell Harriman went looking for a showcase winter destination, and he chose the hills above Ketchum, then a mining-era town surrounded by real terrain. The resort opened in 1936, built to make skiing feel like a full vacation, not just a local sport. That decision didn't just create a resort, it rebranded the entire valley. The mountain that anchors it all is Bald Mountain. Locals call it Baldy, and it's built for long, consistent fall lines instead of short, chaotic pitches. The numbers tell you what that means. A base around 5,750 feet, atop around 950 feet and roughly 3,400 vertical feet in between. In winter, that's Idaho's most polished downhill stage. In summer, it turns into lift-access trail country. But this valley isn't just recreation. It's a geology and industry corridor that existed long before anyone called it glamorous. The bedrock story here is complicated. Stacked fault slices of Paleozoic marine rocks, intrusions from the Idaho batholith, and later volcanic layers from the Chalice volcanic group. Then the Ice Age added its own handwriting, leaving Pleistocene outwash deposits, terraces, and moraines upstream that still define the valley floor and tributary mouths. And Ketchum's Old Idaho phase is not vague folklore. Ore shipments were moving out of the area by 1880, and the boomtown years left a hard imprint on the valley's identity. When mining cooled, the valley didn't go quiet. It pivoted. Between 1910 and 1920, more than 1 million sheep a year were trailed through parts of this region, helping make Ketchum a major sheep shipping center in the American West. That ranching memory is still celebrated in local culture today. Now, pan the lens outward from streets and chairlifts to what actually lives here. At lower elevations, you're in sagebrush and juniper country. Then you climb into aspen, lodgepole pine, and fir forests. Wildlife tracks the same gradient. Mule deer and elk are common, with pronghorn and sage grouse in the open country, and forest residents like black bear, mountain lion, and gray wolf across the wider region. Running through the middle of all this is the Big Wood River, the valley's working artery. It's the reason the cottonwoods hold on where they can, the reason the valley stays green in strips through dry seasons, and the reason fly fishers treat this drainage like it's a calendar item, not a casual stop. Sun Valley and Ketchum also carry a cultural gravity that feels outsized for towns this small. Ernest Hemingway first came here in 1939, kept returning, and eventually made this valley part of his final chapter, with his burial site in Ketchum Cemetery turning into a quiet, ongoing pilgrimage for readers. And that's the real balance of this place. It's not just an elite ski address, and it's not just a historic mountain town either. It's a valley where fault lines, glacial terraces, old mining districts, ranching routes, and modern trail maps all sit on top of each other, and somehow still make a clean, watchable story. From here, the road keeps climbing north, deeper into Idaho's high country, toward sharper peaks, colder water, and the next stretch of this journey where the mountains stop being a backdrop and start becoming the main subject. After Idaho's desert chapters, the state pivots hard into high country. This is Sawtooth National Recreation Area, a protected sweep of central Idaho mountain terrain established on August 22, 1972, under Public Law 92-400, spanning roughly 754,000 acres and managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Our base for this section is Stanley, a small town sitting in the high basin of the Sawtooth Valley. It is surrounded by the Sawtooth Mountains, and the shape of the land tells you immediately what built it. This is glaciated terrain, a basin and range edge where ice once occupied the valleys and left its debris at the range front. Before we climb into the landmarks, look at what lives in these elevation bands. In the upper subalpine forests, whitebark pine grows alongside subalpine fir, Douglas fir, Engelmann spruce, and lodgepole pine, with whitebark pine specifically noted as an Endangered Species Act listed tree on the forest's own materials. In this broader landscape, large mammals commonly documented by the forest include elk, mule deer, mountain goat, bighorn sheep, and black bear, with gray wolf also present in the region. Geologically, the Sawtooth Mountains run north to south and expose a core of Cretaceous granitic rocks tied to the Idaho batholith, with additional older wall rocks and younger intrusions described in USGS work. During the late Pleistocene, valley glaciers repeatedly descended the range, constructing an extensive belt of moraines and leaving a landscape packed with glacial landforms that still dominate how the valleys read on camera today. The first signature substop is Redfish Lake, the largest lake within Sawtooth National Recreation Area and explicitly described as a glacial lake. It sits at about 6,547 feet in elevation, stretches roughly 4.5 miles long, reaches a maximum depth of about 387 feet, and drains out via Redfish Lake Creek toward the Salmon River. At its southern end, the lake is framed by peaks like Mount Hagerman and Grand Mogul, which give the shoreline its iconic sawtooth profile. Its name is not marketing, it is biology and history. Redfish Lake was named for sockeye salmon, Oncorhynchus nurca, the red fish that once returned in numbers so dense they visibly colored the water during spawning season, and today that run persists only in small numbers because of obstacles along the migration route. From here, the route tightens into the high lake circuit above Stanley, where the terrain shows you the glaciers work up close. Sawtooth Lake is an alpine glacial lake high in the Sawtooth Mountains, sitting around 8,135 feet. The main approach from the Iron Creek trailhead climbs roughly 5 miles to the basin, and because of its elevation, Sawtooth Lake can remain frozen into early summer. At the southern end, Mount Regan rises above the waterline, turning the lake into a classic glacial bowl scene where steep walls, talus, and cold water all belong to the same process. Zoom out one more layer, and the range gives you its headline peak. The Sawtooth Range tops out at Thompson Peak, reaching about 10,751 feet, and that vertical relief is why this area stacks hundreds of alpine basins and lakes into such a compact footprint. The mountains are high enough to catch winter moisture, cold enough to store snowpack, and steep enough to translate ice into landforms you can still read from the valley floor. This is the Sawtooths in the Era Trail sense. Not just scenery, but a readable machine. Granitic bedrock, repeated Pleistocene glaciation, a basin town in Stanley, the long dark water of Redfish Lake, and a climb to Sawtooth Lake, where the landscape stops being panoramic and becomes immediate. Coming out of the Sawtooth Mountains, the story stops being alpine basins and starts being a single, relentless line of water. The Salmon River runs about 425 miles, one of the longest free-flowing rivers in the lower 48, dropping out of Idaho's high headwaters and carving west until it meets the Snake River. This corridor is built on hard rock and hard relief. Much of central Idaho here is underlain by the Idaho batholith, dominated by Cretaceous granite and granodiorite, the kind of bedrock that doesn't crumble politely. It breaks into blocks and forces a river to commit to deep cuts. The result is the Salmon River Canyon, described by the Forest Service as one of the deepest gorges in North America, threading between the Salmon River Mountains, the Clearwater Mountains, and the Bighorn Crags. Before we move, clock the living corridor this river supports. Low and mid elevations along the designated corridor are anchored by mixed conifers, ponderosa pine, and Douglas fir, with higher forests shifting into lodgepole pine, spruce, and fir. Along the water, the riparian strip tightens into named species: black cottonwood, quaking aspen, and willows including Booth's willow, Geyer's willow, Beb willow, and coyote willow, plants that literally bind the riverbanks together with root mass. Wildlife reads like a checklist of intact habitat. Along the middle fork of the Salmon River, the nationally designated corridor lists species, including bighorn sheep, mountain goat, Rocky Mountain elk, mule deer, cougar, black bear, bobcat, river otter, and beaver, the kind of density you only get when roads don't lace every drainage. Now, for the route logic, the corridor people dream about is really three linked experiences: the middle fork of the Salmon River, the wild Maine Salmon River, and then the broader lower river as it bends toward the Snake River. The middle fork is a roughly 104-mile free-flowing run that begins northwest of Stanley at the confluence of Bear Valley Creek and Marsh Creek, then drops straight into remote central Idaho. It moves through shifting zones, alpine forest, dry canyon country, and rock-walled sections, inside the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, one of the defining protected landscapes in the state. That wilderness name isn't poetic. The Salmon is widely known as the River of No Return because its swift current and large rapids historically made upstream travel a losing argument. And it's not just one protected ribbon. The Middle Fork and major portions of the system are part of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Network, including the Middle Fork, the Selway, and nearly all of the Maine salmon. If you want the icon version of the salmon, it starts at Corn Creek on the wild Maine Salmon River. That 79-mile wild segment, Corn Creek to Long Tom Bar, was added as a wild river in 1980, and it's managed as a limited entry experience in peak season. This is where the canyon walls close in, the camps become sandbar and pine country, and the river's speed becomes the reason the corridor feels like it has its own momentum. And then there's the migration story. The the reason this river matters beyond scenery. The Salmon River is a major interior pathway for returning Chinook salmon and steelhead, pushing far inland and thousands of feet up into the Rockies. Even reaching the salmon requires navigating 8 dams on the Snake River and Columbia River system, an obstacle course layered on top of an already epic run. So when we say Salmon River Corridor, we're talking about a continuous, readable system. Batholith rock turned into canyon, conifers pinned to aspect and elevation, riparian trees stitched to the banks, and a river that's still allowed to behave like a river. Next, we'll follow this corridor the way it's meant to be experienced, downstream, into the specific stretches that define Idaho's wild water identity. From the Salmon River Corridor, we don't just follow water deeper into Idaho, we follow it into absence. This is the Frank Church River of no return wilderness, a place defined by what it refuses: roads, easy exits, and the idea that the map is in charge. Congress designated it in 1980, and today it covers 2,166,657 acres. In the lower 48, it is the largest contiguous wilderness, and it is managed across multiple forests, with coordination led by the Salmon Challis National Forest. In 1984, the name was expanded to honor Frank Church, the senator whose legacy is welded into the modern wilderness system. Geographically, the wilderness is a brutal, beautiful set of compartments. The Salmon River Mountains dominate the south, the Clearwater Mountains sit north of the main Salmon River, and the Bighorn Crags rise east of the middle fork of the Salmon River. All of it is stitched together by deep cuts and fast water, with the Salmon River Canyon as the core trench that makes this landscape feel larger than its own boundaries. The bedrock here is not subtle. Central Idaho's spine includes the Idaho batholith, with Cretaceous plutons of quartz monzonite and granodiorite documented in USGS work on the region. That hard crystalline foundation is part of why the canyons go deep, the walls fracture into blocks, and the rivers keep their authority. And then there's the modern return of an apex presence. In 1995, gray wolves were reintroduced to central Idaho, with releases at places like Corn Creek on the edge of the Frank Church River of no return wilderness, documented by both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Idaho Fish and Game timelines. Human history here did not begin with permits and trailheads. Forest Service heritage material notes the Tukudika and their homes along river and stream corridors inside what is now this wilderness, and later records point to mining as part of the region's visible historical footprint. The now of this place is access by commitment. Wilderness.net notes dozens of road approaches to trailheads, but also emphasizes how much of the interior remains trail-free, and it documents what makes this wilderness unusual. Small planes can still land on pre-existing primitive airstrips, and jet boats are allowed on the main Salmon River. Forest Service guidance makes the larger rule set clear, too. No new roads, no new landing strips, and no mechanized travel, with limited exceptions tied to the Salmon River itself. So, in the flow of this documentary, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness isn't a single viewpoint or a single hike. It's the backdrop that explains everything else. Why the Salmon River still feels unowned, why the canyons stay intact, and why Idaho can still put a camera on a landscape where the loudest thing is simply moving water. From the interior vastness of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, the story shifts to a different kind of wild. Here, Idaho's edge becomes the main character. The Snake River tightens into a border trench, splitting states and folding the land downward into the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area. 6,52,488 acres set aside in 1975 and managed by the U.S. Forest Service. This is the core claim, and it holds up. Hells Canyon is widely described as North America's deepest river gorge, dropping about 7,993 feet from rim to river in its deepest section. The Snake River runs more than a mile below Oregon's west rim, and on the Idaho side it sits roughly 7,400 feet beneath the peaks of the Seven Devils Mountains. The canyon isn't a single viewpoint, it's a full corridor. The recreation area protects the Snake River stretch between Hells Canyon Dam and the Oregon-Washington border, plus the steep country on both sides, where trails climb from hot canyon benches into forested high ground. A large portion of the NRA is designated wilderness, including the Hells Canyon Wilderness, and the wild and scenic Snake River effectively splits that wilderness into distinct halves in Oregon and Idaho. Geologically, this is a place where the river's job is obvious. The Snake River didn't politely meander through soft sediment. It carved a deep gorge through resistant rock, exposing long walls of basalt and older units in the canyon country. Parts of the region are tied to the Columbia River Basalt Group, one of the major flood basalt provinces of the Pacific Northwest, and that hard volcanic foundation helps explain why the canyon reads as steep, blocky, and uncompromising. Because the elevation range is so extreme, the living world stacks in bands. Down low, the canyon runs dry and hot. Dominant plant communities include sagebrush and native bunch grasses, with tough survivors like prickly pear cactus, and even poison ivy, noted as common in the wider canyon wilderness. Climb into the mid-slopes, and the trees thicken. Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir take the footholds and north-facing pockets. Higher still, the forests shift toward colder, denser species such as western larch, Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir. Wildlife matches that vertical structure. Bighorn sheep are one of the signature animals of this canyon country, built for steep walls and cliff-escape terrain. In the same rugged gradient, you'll see species commonly described for the area such as elk, deer, black bear, and cougar, along with canyon birds like chukar and raptors, including bald eagle, golden eagle, and peregrine falcon. And the Borderlands label isn't just a map detail. It shapes how this place feels on camera. The Snake River is both corridor and boundary. Idaho on one side, Oregon on the other, with the canyon acting like a hard seam stitched between them. The viewpoints are big, but the real scale lands when you watch the river far below and realize the drop isn't a trick of lens compression. It's geography doing what geography does when a major river gets locked into a deep cut. This is why Hells Canyon National Recreation Area sits so cleanly in the documentary's flow. After the interior wilderness of Frank Church, Hells Canyon is the edge, Idaho's hard border where the land falls away, the river takes control, and remote stops being a vibe and becomes the physical shape of the country. Leaving Hells Canyon National Recreation Area behind, the road swings us south and west into Owyhee County, where the map starts looking empty on purpose. This is Idaho's far edge, a high, dry, broken country that hides its scale until you reach a rim and realize the ground doesn't slope down, it drops. The Owyhee Canyonlands are built around three cutting tools: the Owyhee River, the Bruneau River, and the Jarbidge River. The downstream Owyhee River Canyon below the South Fork Owyhee River confluence is literally nicknamed the Grand Canyon of the Owyhee, with steep rhyolite walls rising roughly 250 feet to over 1,000 feet near the Idaho-Oregon line. Right after you arrive, the life of this place shows itself in fragments. Slopes carry sagebrush bunchgrass communities and pockets of juniper. Cliffs and talus fields hold rhyolite rubble and basalt rubble, while spring water stitches in bands of riparian vegetation along the bends. On the botanical side, the region has a true local oddity, the Owyhee River forget-me-not, a rare plant found only in this river system, living on north-facing rhyolitic cliffs and shaded crevices. Wildlife reads like a high desert roll call: California bighorn sheep, elk, mule deer, pronghorn, predators like cougars, bobcats, coyotes and badgers, plus river otters in the water corridors. The canyon walls double as nesting real estate for cliff-loving raptors, and the broader area overlaps priority habitat for greater sage grouse. In the Bruneau River drainage, there's also a tiny, high-stakes resident, the Bruneau hot spring snail, tied to geothermal habitat near the lower river. Geologically, this whole region is a long volcanic argument carved into exposure. The rivers run through the Owyhee volcanic field, with volcanic activity dated to the Miocene era, about 25 to 3 million years ago. Where basalt caps the rims, you'll often find rhyolite formations nested below, and erosion turns the margins into towers and spires. The most iconic forms here are the sculpted pinnacles called hoodoos, and the system is noted for being one of the largest concentrations of shear-walled rhyolite basalt canyons in the western United States. Even the river's geometry gets weird in places, like the Oxbow Canyon known as the Tules on the East Fork Owyhee River. The Owyhee River itself is a long thread across state lines, about 346 miles, starting in northern Nevada, cutting through southwestern Idaho, and finishing in Oregon. A key protected reach in Idaho was designated March 30, 2009, and the listed classification for that Idaho segment is wild, totaling 67.3 miles. Even the name has teeth. Owyhee is an older spelling connected to Hawaii, and in Idaho, it stuck after 3 native Hawaiian fur trappers disappeared during an 1819-1820 expedition. The region kept the older spelling even as Hawaii became standard elsewhere. What makes the Idaho side of the Owyhee Canyonlands feel so protected is that on paper it literally is. The Omnibus Public Land Management Act, signed March 30, 2009, designated 6 wilderness areas in Owyhee County: Big Jacks Creek Wilderness, Bruneau-Jarbidge Rivers Wilderness, Little Jacks Creek Wilderness, North Fork Owyhee Wilderness, Owyhee River Wilderness, and Pole Creek Wilderness. Together, they total about 517,000 acres, collectively and informally known as the Owyhee Canyonlands Wilderness Areas. The same law designated 16 wild and scenic river segments, totaling about 325 miles across this landscape. On the ground, that protection translates to a very specific kind of travel. The canyons are shaped for rim-to-water perspective shifts, where a short hike can turn into a full descent through tailless slopes into the sound of current. For river runners, much of the system sits around Class 2 whitewater, but sections spike hard, with Class 4 through Class 6 water in places like the Lambert Gorge and Garrett Gorge. This is also why it stays quiet. The canyons hide you with their turns and walls, and the remoteness is not branding, it is logistics. And when the light finally drops out here, the Owyhee Canyonlands don't go dark so much as they return to baseline. You leave the river corridor, climb back onto the basalt rimrock, and the last thing you notice is how far the silence reaches before the first star even shows up. After Idaho's canyonlands and border gorges, the documentary makes a clean geographic jump north into the Idaho Panhandle, where the state turns greener, wetter, and more lake-built. This is Lake Coeur, a long glacially shaped basin that runs roughly 22 miles north-south, covering about 129 kilometers square, and reaching a maximum depth of about 64 meters. The lake's why is Ice Age engineering. Lake Coeur was created about 13,000 years ago after repeated outburst floods from glacial Lake Missoula dumped massive gravel deposits into the Rathdrum Prairie Spokane River Valley, effectively damming the old Pleistocene Spokane River system and its main tributaries, the Coeur d'Alene River and the St. Joe River. Today, the lake is natural, but not unmanaged. Its outlet drains to the Spokane River, and its seasonal levels are influenced by Post Falls Dam operations downstream. USGS work notes that dam operation maintains the lake surface roughly 2.1 meters higher than normal through late summer, changing wetland, lateral lake dynamics, and expanding shallow open water areas in the south. This is also a lake with a living border. The Coeur d'Alene Tribe's reservation lies around the southern half of the lake, and USGS notes the southern end is under tribal jurisdiction, where the lake connects into a chain of shallow waters: Benua Lake, Chatcolet Lake, Hidden Lake, and Round Lake, areas that were historically more wetland-dominated before the dam era reshaped seasonal water. over the water and marsh edges, the wildlife story gets loud. Bald eagle, wintering and foraging, is a known North Idaho pattern along this lake corridor, and the same near-shore zones support osprey and a rotating cast of waterbirds through migration seasons. Under the surface, this is one of those lakes where recreation and ecology are the same sentence. Idaho Fish and Game Zone Planner lists game fish, including kokanee, largemouth bass, and panfish like bluegill, alongside other warm water species that make the lake fishable across seasons and skill levels. But Lake Coeur also carries a heavier modern chapter, legacy mining upstream. The Coeur d'Alene River Basin, especially the South Fork Corridor, was historically a major silver-lead-zinc producer, and both the state and EPA describe the lake bottom as holding millions of tons of metal-bearing sediments, with contaminants including lead, zinc, and cadmium tied to historic mining and waste movement through the river system. That's what makes Lake Coeur d'Alene such a clean Idaho destination in this documentary. It's not just a pretty lake town backdrop. It's Ice Age flood history, modern water level control, tribal homeland and jurisdiction, forested mountain shoreline, big bird winter corridors, and a real-world environmental legacy, all in one frame, with the Spokane River carrying the story onward. From Lake Coeur d'Alene, the Idaho Panhandle keeps getting bigger and deeper. More water, more forest, more sky reflected like glass. Lake Oreille is the heavyweight up here, Idaho's largest lake stretched long through the mountains and fed by the Clark Fork River, then draining out through the Oreille River. Before we talk numbers, look at the living frame around the water. North Idaho's mixed conifer forests stack species that thrive in cool, wet terrain: western red cedar, western hemlock, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and western larch, with western white pine as Idaho's state tree in this same northern forest mix. That biology makes sense when you see the topography. The lake's shore isn't a gentle ring of beaches, it's a steep, forested basin where mountains press close, creating shaded slopes, cold water tributaries, and long stretches of undeveloped shoreline that still feel like backcountry even when you're not far from town. Now, the scale. Lake Oreille runs about 43 miles long, covers roughly 148 miles, and drops to a maximum depth of about 351 meters, deep enough that the lake doesn't just hold water, it holds volume. Its main inflows include the Clark Fork River and the Pack River, and its outflow is the Oreille River. The Y is Ice Age mussel. The basin sits in the Purcell Trench, and the National Park Service frames this area as a key piece of the Ice Age flood story, carved by repeated Pleistocene ice advances and then scoured by massive flood events tied to outburst flood dynamics in the region. And like so many big western lakes, it's natural but regulated. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operates Albini Falls Dam, which regulates the top 11 feet of Lake Oreille as part of the broader Columbia River power and water system, storing spring and summer water and releasing it later when demand is higher. On the shore, Sandpoint is the human anchor, more lakefront than city, built where transportation lines met water. In 1882, the Northern Pacific Railroad reached the area, and that arrival helped turn the settlement into a timber and trade node. Over time, the community's name shifted to Sandpoint, and the town grew into the primary population center on the lake. If you want the "this is why people stay here" shot, it's the viewpoint from above town. Schweitzer Mountain sits in the Selkirk Mountains, overlooking Lake Pen d'Oreille, a vantage that makes the lake read like an inland sea and makes Sandpoint feel like it's built on the edge of something far larger than itself. Under the surface, the lake's identity is also a fishery story. Idaho Fish and Game notes that Lake Pen d'Oreille supports native fish like West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout, alongside numerous non-native species, and the lake's food web links strongly to kokanee salmon, a key forage fish in this system. So this stop lands for two reasons at once. Lake Pen d'Oreille is pure North Idaho beauty, forest, depth, and open water, while Sandpoint gives it a front porch, a rail-built history, and a skyline view that proves this Panhandle Lake country isn't a side chapter. It's one of Idaho's main statements. From Lake Pen d'Oreille and Sandpoint, the Panhandle pulls us farther north, into a quieter basin where the forests thicken, the roads thin out, and the water turns unnervingly clear. This is Priest Lake, tucked into the Selkirk Mountains, a place that feels less like a stop and more like Idaho's northern end cap. Priest Lake runs roughly 19 miles north-south and reaches over 300 feet deep, with water fed by streams dropping off the high Selkirk peaks. It's also paired with a second, more remote basin, Upper Priest Lake, linked to the main lake by the narrow channel locals call the Thoroughfare. Right up front, here's what lives around this waterline. The park and surrounding forests are defined by dense conifers, western red cedar, fir, western larch, and the wildlife list is the kind you expect from a cooler, wetter Panhandle basin: white-tailed deer, black bear, moose, and bald eagle. Out on the lake itself, the fishery is part of the identity. Idaho Fish and Game highlights species like kokanee, yellow perch, and lake trout. The why of this place is glacial. The wider Priest River Valley shows clear Ice Age shaping, and Idaho Geological Survey work describes how a tongue of ice in the region blocked drainages and formed a glacial lake in the southern Priest River Valley. Exactly the kind of process that leaves behind long, deep basins and lake country topography. And when you look at the mountains wrapping the basin, you're looking at the backbone. The Selkirk Mountains, part of the larger Columbia Mountains, spanning the northern Idaho Panhandle and extending into Washington and British Columbia. Geology matters here because it explains the shape and the texture. USGS work describes the Selkirks as being cored by intrusive rocks like granodiorite and quartz monzonite, with older belt supergroup rocks on the flanks, an architecture that helps produce steep ridges, hard-walled valleys, and that carved basin look around the lake. One landmark that makes this tangible is Chimney Rock, a sharp granitic tower east of the lake. Its runoff draining toward Priest Lake on one side and the Pack River on the other, an easy visual for how ridgelines divide entire water systems. Then we move into the now of how this place is experienced. Priest Lake State Park spreads across multiple units on the shoreline, but the real signature move is leaving the easy access behind and pushing toward Upper Priest Lake, described by Idaho Parks and Recreation as reachable only by foot, mountain bike, or boat. This is where the basin becomes quieter, the shoreline feels less claimed, and the lake starts behaving like backcountry. And there's a hard protection story behind that quiet. The entire shoreline of Upper Priest Lake is in state of Idaho or federal ownership, administered as a scenic area. One of the reasons it still feels like a preserved version of the Panhandle's lake era. So, as a final destination, Priest Lake and the Selkirks land like a summary of North Idaho: glacial basins, batholithic rock cores, deep forests, and cold, clear water that holds the sky almost too well. It's a closing note that doesn't need a grand speech, just a last, steady look across the lake, and the understanding that Idaho's wilderness isn't one aesthetic. It's a whole spectrum, and this is one of its cleanest endpoints. Idaho doesn't travel in one direction, it shifts. We started in the south where the Snake River drops over Shoshone Falls, then crossed into volcanic country at Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, where the ground is still shaped by ancient eruptions. We moved through stone architecture at City of Rocks National Reserve, then read Deep Time at Hagerman Fossil Beds National Monument, where the past is literally stored in the bluffs. From there, the state opened into extremes, moving sand and dark sky at Bruneau Dunes State Park, mountain town clarity in Sun Valley and Ketchum, and the clean, cold lift of the Sawtooth National Recreation Area around Stanley, Redfish Lake, and Sawtooth Lake. We followed the backbone of the Salmon River into the vast silence of the Frank Church River of no return wilderness, then hit the hard border cut of Hell's Canyon National Recreation Area and the remote depth of the Owyhee Canyonlands. And in the Panhandle, Idaho turned into water and forest, Lake Coeur d'Alene, Lake Oreille and Sandpoint, and finally, Priest Lake under the Selkirk Mountains, where the country feels like it's holding its breath. That's the point of this trail. Idaho isn't one postcard. It's a chain of different worlds stitched into a single state. If you enjoyed this journey, help us keep Era Trails alive. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next trail. And if you want us to cover a specific region next, drop it in the comments. Until then, keep your eyes open, keep your map curious, and I'll see you on the next Era Trail.